we'll start out with a review. Our main character is who? Anybody remember who the main character is?
It's not me, Mommy.
Starts with a B. So our main character is Billy, and it calls him the boy in the Alamo because he was just, I believe he's just 13. No, he's 12, turning 13. Anyway, he is following his older brother, Buck, who is just kind of getting over this girl. Him and this other girl were dating. The other girl marries somebody else. So Buck says, I'm going to go join the army and go fight for Texas. So he leaves their home, follows Davy Crockett, joins the volunteers at the Alamo. And that's where we really see the story begin. That's where we pick it up. So at the Alamo, they're surrounded by all the Mexican troops, and the leader of the Mexican troops, Santa Anna, and he's the El Presidente of Mexico, and he's kind of a ruthless dictator, meaning he doesn't always follow the government rules like he's supposed to. Okay, go. Alright, so we are continuing on. Colonel Travis writes a letter to get help. Colonel Travis draws a line in the sand. That was a really big moment. He draws that line in the sand and he says, reinforcements don't look like they're coming. Those that are prepared to die fighting for liberty cross this line. Alright. Chapter 10. And I know Chapter 10 is going to seem familiar because we've read Chapter 10, but I wanted to reread Chapter 10 again because Chapter 10 is where most of the battle took place. Hey, Bobby, if you'd like to sit and listen to the story, you can. But don't interrupt the video, okay? Do you want to sit and listen to the story?
Yeah.
Okay. Get a pillow?
Yeah.
Every now and then, over the gunfire, you could still hear Davy Crockett singing, "Come to my bower," as if he were inviting the Mexicans in. Any of them that got close tasted his lead. The desperate situation seemed to excite him. He got out his old fiddle and went from battle station to battle station, sawing out play party music to rally the men. Every now and then, in my out-of-the-way post, I could hear the thin wail of his fiddle. Most of the time, you couldn't hear anything but the roar and the pound of the cannons and the shrill shh of bullets. So, if you remember, Billy's been put in charge of the women and children, and so he's off in the chapel protecting the women and children. So he's not directly in the battle, but the battle's kind of all around him right now. So he can see everything that's happening and hear everything that's happening. Lupe crept out of the inside room once, but I drove her back. I walked up and down before the door of the outer room, holding my dark knife in my hand. I still didn't have a gun. They were too scarce for this kind of detail. About 6 o'clock that night, there was a terrible explosion in the plaza, and I broke my trust and ran to the edge of the chapel and looked toward the north wall. A great jagged hole had been torn in by the Mexican cannon, wide enough for a company of men to march through. The wall no longer offered us any safety. The air was full of smoke and the dust of powdered adobe, and the men were running around trying to set up a new position for the cannon nearest to the hole. Now there is nothing to keep them from coming through, I thought, and hurried back to my post. I went into the inner room. They have broken through the wall, I said to Miss Dickinson. Only God can help us now, Miss Dickinson said, and began to pray. Lupe and Miss Mendoza went down on their knees and began to tell the beads of the rosaries. Suddenly, the cannonading ceased. A dead quiet fell over everything, for as soon as our men realized the shooting had stopped, our batteries ceased firing. After 5 days of unending gunfire, the stillness was scary. So think about that for a minute. It's been 5 days, 120 hours of just gunfire and gunfire and gunfire and gunfire, and then all of a sudden it stops. Gonna be a little spooky, right? The hole gaped in the plaza wall, but no one came towards it. Colonel Travis made the rounds of all the positions. He even came to our door. It is some trick, he said to me, but let us all take advantage of it and get some rest. Except for 3 sentries placed outside the walls and the lookouts, who still turned their red eyes towards the east, hoping against hope for reinforcements, men lay down where they were and began to snore. Until the guns stopped, they had not known how tired they were. Miss Dickinson took Angelina in her arms and lay down in the corner of the room. Miss Mendoza covered them with a blanket. Then she sat down and leaned against the wall and closed her eyes. Lupe was curled up on the floor like a kitten. If it was a trick, I could not leave them unguarded. I stood up and walked, pacing back and forth, before the door. I went to sleep standing up and slid down the wall to the floor and knew no more. It must have been past midnight then. Our sentries were relieved at midnight, and other tired men took their places. I heard them shuffle out past the chapel to the gate. They never came back. They did not live to give us another warning. Sometime after that, I heard a wild shout. It was from one of the lookouts, who in the light of the setting moon noticed the stirring of creeping men in the shadows. The garrison popped and roared to life, mumbling, cold, silly with sleep that had been too little and too late. I ran into the inner room, but the women were still sleeping. When I got back to the door, the shrill bugle call sounding the charge blared out. I ran towards the plaza and saw Mexicans begin to pour over the walls on all 4 sides by the hundreds. They looked like black ants. So when the author says, or when Billy describes the Mexican soldiers pouring over the wall and looking like black ants, what type of figurative language is that? Is that a simile? Is that a metaphor? Or is that personification? They looked like black ants. Yeah, that's going to be a simile because it's using that comparison, but using like or as. Okay? Good job, Tiana. Good job, Leona. Let's see. They had scaling ladders, crowbars, pickaxes, knives, and guns with bayonets. It was a hideous sight. I covered my eyes to shut it out, and as I did, there fell on my ears the most terrible sound I'd ever heard. It was deguelo, the bugle call to murder. The military bands assembled at Santa Anna's headquarters took up the call and swelled it until it seemed to fill the whole world. It meant that nobody was to be left alive. There was no mistaking its message. It was not like any sound I had ever heard, but it made me remember the time Buck and I had been squirrel shooting over towards Coon Creek at home, and we saw a black panther leap out of a pin oak and onto a calf. "Don't listen and don't look," Buck had said to me that day. So now I covered my ears and turned my face back toward the room where the women were. And so we see all the Mexican soldiers climbing over the walls. I could hear our gunfire and the sound of falling bodies, and then it was quiet again, and I heard Colonel Crockett shouting, "Tell Santa Anna he will eat snakes before he gets over this wall." After a while, the terrible bugle call began again. "What is it?" Lupe cried at my elbow. "Get back! Get back!" I hissed at her. "Don't show yourself. They are over the walls." She began to sob. "It is such awful music," she said. "It hurts my throat." "Go back inside and stay very quiet," I said. "If Angelina cries, put your hand over her mouth. They must not know you're here." For what seemed like hours, nothing happened, and I knew we had beaten them off. But as the sky paled and day began to come, I could hear shrieks and cries and thuds in the plaza from where I stood, and I knew the Mexicans were making the second attack. The barrage of gunfire almost drowned the sound of the bugle, and it was a relief. Then again, what do you need? Cereal. You have cereal. Go eat it. Then again, everything was almost still for a moment. I crept over to the opening, and I could see our men mounted on their platforms with their knives drawn. Colonel Travis was standing at the north wall. So, if you remember, during this time period, all the guns were single shots, which means you put one of the ball bullets into the gun, okay, and it takes about a minute or 45 seconds in between every shot. So if they're far away, you could reload a gun, but if they're close, you might get one shot off, and you're not going to be able to reload the gun. So that's why they've all got their knives out, and that's why the Mexican soldiers had bayonets on the ends of their guns, which are like long spikes. Because after you shoot that one bullet, the gun's useless. It's almost a bat, and so they had to have these spikes on the end of their guns. Colonel Travis was standing at the north wall. With him was Joe, his body servant. Colonel Crockett was at the earthworks. He had a tomahawk and his rifle. About 8 o'clock, it all began over again. But this time, the Mexicans were forced to our wall by gunfire behind them from their own army at Santa Anna's orders. So that's how ruthless Santa Anna was, is he's shooting, even putting his own people in danger. The noise in the plaza was fierce, and when I ran to the edge of the chapel to look, I saw the plaza was filled with Mexican soldiers, and the Texians were fighting them, hand to hand, on top of the walls and in the plaza. I went back to my post. There was some timber left over from the scaffolding we had built in the unroofed part of the chapel, and I dragged it up and made a barricade around the door of the inner room. The women were crouching in corners of that room. "Don't be afraid," I said. "I won't let them in here." I had my dirk in my hands. How much I wished for a gun. The wail of Deguelo went on. I do not know how many hours the battle lasted. I was afraid to leave my post and go find out. We fought for every inch of that plaza, but they came over the walls and through the breach like flocks of sheep. And you hear that comparison again, okay, where they compare two things and use like or as, which we just said was a type of... What type of figurative language would be a comparison be that we use like or as? There we go, it's a simile. Good. They they went through the breach like flocks of sheep. When they had got in control of the plaza, the Texians retreated to the barracks and stone houses where we had been quartered, and then to the inner court where Lupe and I had played war, fighting for it inch by inch. Our end of the chapel stayed clear for a long time, and then a Mexican came running into it from the plaza. A bullet. Stop. Thank you. A bullet hit him not 10 feet from the doorway where I stood. He dropped to the dirt floor and rolled over and lay still, with his gun still smoking in his hands. I looked at him with horror, for I had never seen such a thing happen before my eyes. I felt small and alone, and not like a man, but like a child after all I had said. Remember, during the whole book, he's been convincing himself and other people, no, I can do that. I'm a man. I'm responsible. No, I can do that. I'm a man. I'm responsible. I thought I would vomit. Then someone was beside me, and I started in terror at a touch. I looked, and Lupe put her hand in mine and said, I will stay here with you. Do not try to make me go back. She had climbed over the barricade I had built, and I was too confused to try to make her go back, where it was safer. Before I could stop her, she darted towards the Mexican and leaned down and dragged the pistol out of his hand. Lupe, I shouted, loco, crazy girl. He may be possuming. He is dead, she said calmly. Here is his gun. Girls never ceased to surprise me. She did not seem the least bit frightened. She handed me the pistol. It was silver mounted and weighed down my hand. We stood there, side by side, and waited for what would happen next. Chapter 11. All is lost. I could not bear to look at the dead man. It made my stomach feel all gone. We are the Texian army, Lupe said. He is the Mexican army. Although I knew it was wrong, I was glad she was there. I did not want to be alone with the man who had been running a minute before and now would never run again. It was not the time to wonder about wars or why men shoot each other, but I wondered. He had once been a boy like me. In a little while, Captain Dickinson stumbled across the chapel floor towards us. He was covered with dirt and powder burns, and he had lost his cap, and his hair hung down in his eyes. Stand inside the door, he panted. No one knows you are here yet. His face looked wild and woebegone. Lupe and I moved back, and Captain Dickinson vaulted the barricade to the inner room and took Miss Dickinson in his arms. How is it going? She asked. Heaven help us, Sue. The Mexicans are in the fort. If you live, take care of our child. Travis is down with a ball in the head. So, remember, okay, their bullets weren't really like bullets. They were metal balls, okay? So, Travis is down with a ball in the head, okay? Means he's dead. He got shot in the head. But he drew his sword and killed a Mexican as he fell. Is there any hope, Almiron? Miss Dickinson asked him. I'm afraid not, he said. We are outnumbered, 100 to 1. God bless you, my darling. Farewell. Miss Dickinson was crying. We will meet again somewhere, somehow. And without looking back, Captain Dickinson jumped over the barricade and ran towards the inner court, where the sound of the battle was in its fullest. Lupe and I crouched inside the door. I had cocked my pistol, and I held the dirk knife in my hand. In a few minutes, we saw a lone Mexican soldier walking towards our door like a cat. He was looking all around our end of the chapel and listening, with his head on one side. I put my finger on my lips to tell Lupe to be quiet, and I tiptoed to the barricade. Don't make a sound, I whispered to the sobbing women. Don't let the baby cry. One of them is out there. They muffled their sobs. Lupe and I crouched in the shadows. As the man got nearer the door, I could stand it no longer. I rose up like a hinge being sprung, and Lupe rose beside me. He was almost on us when Lupe, pushed beyond her strength, shrieked, Vamos! Vamos! We caught him by surprise. He straightened up and looked at us. If you come one step nearer, I will shoot you like a dog, I shouted, brandishing the gun. He continued to walk towards us. The light glanced off his bayonet. Lupe translated this into Spanish in a shrill shriek. "Here," I said to Lupe and handed her the dirk. "Fight him if you have to." And Lupe grasped the knife like a dagger. The Mexican threw back his head and laughed. "Muchachos," he roared. "No tengo tiempo para muchachos." "He says he has no time for children," Lupe said. He laughed some more, wiped his face with a bandana, and turned to go. I let the hammer of the pistol. I let fly. I see that. Hey, can you take that into the kitchen?
Daddy.
I see that. Can you take that into the kitchen, please?
Daddy, he has a yellow and white in it.
I let fly the hammer of the pistol, but it did not go off. It was empty. I had a gun, but I had no bullets. But the Mexican had gone towards the inner court. We were saved for the moment. "Was he afraid of us?" Lupe asked. "Coward? Cucaracho?" It was then that I saw Buck. He was staggering towards us, holding his side.
Can you help, please?
His face was so white that the freckles stood out on it like fly specks, and it was streaked with dirt and blood and what looked like tears, and his eyes were red. His lips were parched and chapped, and he had a wild, sad look about him. "Buck, are you hurt?" I screamed and ran towards him. "The battle is going against us, Will," he said. "If we don't come through, you must make your way back home. Do you understand me?" "Yes, Buck. You made a good try," he said, swaying, and he patted my arm. Now stand guard out here. I want to speak to Miss Dickinson." He went in the room and dragged himself over my barricade. I heard him asking for water. I stood holding my empty pistol, and Lupe put the dirt back in my hand. "You keep it," she said. I felt very tired. Buck did not look right to me. He had been holding his side in a funny way. I was terribly lonesome then. I didn't know what was the matter with me, but I wanted to lie down on the dirt floor and cry and cry. Miss Dickinson had climbed over the barricade and came and stood beside Lupe and me. She put her hand on my head as if I were a child, and I saw the tears were running down her face. "I need water very badly," she said. "Our canteen has run dry." Before I could move to run towards the well in the inner court, the barricade before the doors of the chapel were broken down, and the Mexican soldiers swarmed into the main room in a howling mob. They were like wild animals, shouting and hissing above the sound of the deguelo, which never stopped its terrible wailing. We flattened ourselves against the wall, and they rushed by us like a herd of stampeding cattle into the baptistry of the chapel, where Colonel Bowie, who was choking with pneumonia, had been brought for safekeeping. I saw him lying there, on his cot, flat on his back, his face red with the fever, brandishing a brace of pistols. Ham, his body servant, was crouched at the foot of the cot, mumbling prayers. Colonel Bowie shot the first two Mexicans that came toward him, and I saw them fall. So, in the legend of the Alamo, and it's a legend because, most people died, so there's not a lot of people that can confirm it, but the knowledge is that, Colonel Bowie was really sick, so he's lying in bed. And when the Mexicans rushed in, the story is that Colonel Bowie is lying there almost dying on the bed, and he's got two pistols in his hands. And as the Mexican soldiers bust through the door, he goes, "Caca!" and shoots the first two that come in through the door. But then again, remember, once you shoot the gun, It's over. There's not a bullet. Colonel Bowie shot the first two Mexicans that came towards him, and I saw them fall. Don't look, Miss Dickinson cried, and turned Lupe and me toward the wall, and stood between us and the door, with her arms out and her skirts spread to hide the sight of the Mexicans, with their drawn bayonets descending on the sick man. Angelina began to shriek in the inner room, and Miss Dickinson said, "Promise me you won't go out the door. I must look after the baby. Stay right here until I come back." I crept to the door, and Lupe followed me across the chapel, and then we saw him coming, the officer, with the gold braids on his uniform and shining boots. There was nothing for it but to make a stand. I spread my feet in the door, holding the empty pistol in one hand and my dirk knife in the other. "Halt!" I shouted when he was 20 feet away. "If you come one step nearer, I will fill you full of holes." So here we see Colonel Bowie in bed, shooting the first two Mexican soldiers that come through the door. But we also see the other Mexican soldiers behind him with their bayonets drawn, ready to stab him. He stopped short and looked at us, and then drew his sword. I could almost feel the cold blade against my throat, but I stood my ground. Then he took a white silk handkerchief out of his pocket and tied it to the sword blade, which he held in front of him. He made me a military bow. I recognized the handkerchief as the white flag of a truce. "Advance, or walk towards me," I said, my teeth chattering against each other. I was shaking all over as if I had a chill from the malaria. What would happen to my brother Buck now? "I present the compliments of General Santa Anna," he said in English. "Will Campbell, at your service," I said. "Colonel Crockett's Tennessee Volunteers." He smiled. "I'm Colonel Almonte," he said. "What have you here?" He touched Lupe's curls. "Women and children only." I lied. I did not want them to know Buck was there. "This is Guadalupe, daughter of Captain Mendoza." "Texian!" Lupe spat out. "Senorita," the officer bowed to her, "I could wish you were on my side." Lupe glared at him, and she said, "But I'm not." "Shall we lay down our arms?" he asked, and he took off the white flag and put his sword back in the scabbard. I put my dirk in my belt and laid the empty pistol on the floor. "General Santa Anna has instructed me to offer you safe conduct to San Antonio de Bexar," he said. "The Alamo has fallen." So we had lost the battle. Are we to be with the prisoners?" I asked, thinking of Buck. "There are no prisoners," Colonel Almonte said, and a chill ran down my spine. So if you remember, okay, think back to when we talked about the bugle call, that El Diguelo, okay, and it's the bugle call that there's going to be no prisoners taken because Santa Anna's troops, or the army, is going to murder everybody. And so knowing that is one thing, but then coming to the end of it and realizing what that means to Billy is a completely different thing. And Billy's now just realizing that that could have very real impact on him. And when we read more of the story, and I post the rest of this tomorrow, you'll see how that connects, how him realizing what "there are no prisoners" means, what him realizing what that El Diguelo means. All right, well, I thank y'all for tuning in today. If you want to recap the story, or if you missed the story, it's going to be on there, and we will finish the book. Yeah, we're going to finish the book tomorrow at 9:30. All right, thank you guys.